I followed up with one client every 2 weeks for more than 4 years. Never once called me back. Never once sent me an email saying buzz off. Got nothing from him. It was silence. And he phoned me one day. My phone rang. I agree with the fact is most deals aren't lost. People fade away more than they just don't follow up. Now I could have my AI agent, prospecting agent, talk to their AI agent who's answering the phone, and everybody can have a telephone call. Nobody buys crap.
Welcome back to the SaaS Playbook. This is the show where founders and B2B leaders sit down and have the kind of honest, commercially grounded conversations that don't really happen on LinkedIn anymore. No polished posts, no recycled frameworks, just the real stuff behind how operators actually build, sell, and scale. This episode is brought to you by Hera Digital. We work with founders who've built something genuinely good, but keep hitting the same wall where the pipeline is inconsistent. If that sounds like something of interest to you, drop the word engine below and someone will be in touch. Today, I'm joined by Colin Parker, founder of Lone Star Sales Performance. Colin spent years in software sales, including a stint as VP of a billion-dollar company before stepping out to build something of his own. What he's built is now genuinely different. He works with brilliant operators, double doctorates, MIT grads, deeply technical founders who can architect anything except for their own follow-up. Colin calls it sales anxiety, and this whole approach is built around closing the gap between knowing what to do and actually doing it. Colin, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So now you've been on both sides of the table now, Colin. Billion-dollar VP, now solo operator, and you mentioned that you're doing that out of personal preference. But what's the moment you realized the lifestyle side mattered more than the title?
It was interesting that I happened to, at the time, one of the things I was doing was going to small companies, and typically that hit the ceiling, sort of that $2 to $3 million mark, and helping them grow up to about $5 million. And typically at that time, if you got up to about $5 million, you were sellable. But everybody was sort of running into that end. And what ended up happening was I ended up in a beautiful place in the Okanagan in British Columbia. There was no traffic. I'm used to Toronto traffic, California traffic, and all of a sudden there's no traffic. They'll tell you there's traffic, but there's no traffic here. And so I'm surrounded by wineries. I came here for a small software company. We sold that company. And then it was like, do I want to do this again? Do I want to move to somewhere that actually has traffic? That was sort of the moment I thought, maybe I'll just start my own business. I don't know if I had lots of people who start their own business have that desire to do it. There was nothing wrong with getting a paycheck. I made lots of money that way. But I have to say that being in your own business, working with the clients you want to work with has big advantages to it. And no traffic.
Can I just say though, I wanted to add to that. Yours definitely was a lifestyle choice by the sounds of it, but it also was, I just want to touch that it's not for everyone. And the reason why I say this is because there's a lot of ups and downs. Whereas, when you clock in, you get a paycheck, it's very standardized, you know exactly what's coming. Whereas if you're up for a bit of a roller coaster, then yeah, I'd say go for it. For the most part, just be prepared for the inconsistencies. Now, you talk about working with people who are objectively brilliant, but still get stuck on the basics like follow-up, nurturing. What do you think most sales coaches or business owners get wrong about why that actually happens?
Well, I think we get stuck in the fact that we think it's people don't know what to do. And I've had consulting firms and others bring me in. To be honest, they could have fixed it just by following up. Somehow they feel that it must be more difficult than that. It must be something more complex and I think that's also a bit of an excuse, because if it's not complex, you could have fixed it years ago. But really what happens, and I saw this both when I had teams and then with individual clients, is my clients are very smart. And the fact is, they know after a trade show they should follow up. They know that they should call those new companies that are entering the market that they're ideal clients, but they don't. And giving them more tactics doesn't help. It actually makes the situation worse because it's the feeling inside that they get. They get anxiety. And anxiety is really about uncertainty and visibility. And when you add the two, anxiety climbs. And so sales lovingly is just full of uncertainty and anxiety. And especially if you come from a very disciplined type of business. So if you're an engineer, if your background is in software engineering, if your background is as a doctor or a consultant, all of a sudden you bank on certainty. You bank on things being the way they are. You give certain advice. And then all of a sudden you're thrown into a sales role or having to sell yourself. And that is completely uncertain. Everything you do, you can do all the right things. You've been down this path. You can do all the right things with a client and you still get no. And that's not because you did anything wrong. It's just not right for them right now. And that's tough to take. And I was always amazed that sometimes you would find a top salesperson in an organization couldn't prospect. Great, knock them dead when they come into a client, but when you would say to them, you need to do more prospecting, they just couldn't do it. And again, that's sort of the anxiety because being in a sales meeting, you at least have some type of permission to be there. Now I'm interrupting you when I'm prospecting. I don't know if you want to take my phone call. Nobody ever does. I don't know if you want to take my LinkedIn request. All that just makes people stop. And when they stop is that you can't move forward. And so what we really found was that me telling a client is, here's the perfect strategy. If you do this strategy, doesn't help them actually perform the strategy. Best strategy in the world that never gets out into the domain just goes nowhere. And that's typically what we see a lot of times with clients is that they get stuck and giving them more information. And I think AI is making this worse. AI, I can get any type of answer that I want. I get all this information, but I have to put it into play. And that's a human thing. That's an anxiety thing that typically comes up. And so they try and avoid the visibility. And it all sounds very professional, like I won't follow up because, well, I don't want to bother them. Where they know where to find me if they want this. And so we sound professional or we delay by saying, well, I really need to work on my website or I need this marketing piece before I move forward. That's usually not the blockage they have. The blockage is actually making themselves visible, putting themselves out there. And it
Mm.
all can be fixed, interesting enough. But it tends to be different for everybody. It's sort of not, you could have 5 salespeople, they could all struggle with different areas. It could be they don't bounce back from no very well. It could be that it doesn't align with their identity. I've got a doctorate. I shouldn't be having to prospect.
A lot of it's ego as well, I find, Colin, because in my experience within corporate sales itself is you're right. A lot of BDMs or what you call closers will not do the prospecting. And in my experience, that's because they think that they're better at closing. So therefore they should focus on the closing. They're all very valid points, but I feel like a well-rounded salesperson can do both because it's two ends of the sword, right? But also there's different layers of the sales process. And I think a lot of when we think about founders who are going into business, particularly if it's their first or second time, they don't have these foundations from a sales perspective. And I think it's really interesting how the AI space has sort of infiltrated what you and I know to be sort of the normal or the baseline for B2B sales. And I think what's really interesting is it's opening the gates for that same salesperson who refuses to do prospecting and outreach to make the path of resistance a bit less because they're like, well, if I deploy an email and LinkedIn and then call them, that's 3 touches. And that's a lot less contribution to their anxiety because like, oh, I feel like that person knows who I am now because they've seen my LinkedIn profile, but can actually attach this email that I'm about to send or this call to a face. And I think it has been able to make a significant impact. But I think just to sort of summarize that point is I think it actually has to do a lot with ego, Colin,
Well,
if you would
well,
agree.
yes and no. Sure, I think some if you've done a lot of prospecting in your past, you absolutely can't get past that. And the fact that you don't feel like you should be doing it now, absolutely get. But I think that often sometimes in those things that appear to be ego is something else we're seeing. So that to say it's beneath me feels like sort of a professional thing to say is that I'm better than this. The
Mm.
reality often is they just can't do it. They can't bring themselves to do it. I have to admit, when I first started sales, I probably sounded like Porky Pig on Red Bull. I was terrible. I talked fast. I was nervous beyond belief. You got past that over a period of time if you wanted to live indoors and eat regularly, both things I enjoy. But I think now is that I think there's what happens is if the knowledge gap starts to collapse. So is that how you sell is going to make a very big difference on whether you get the business or not. And so we're looking at all these AI tools. Well, if everybody has exactly the same tools, it's very hard to differentiate yourself from the other options that are out there. And, one of the things we talk about, because I do deal a lot with consultants who are selling knowledge, but your average client can't tell the difference, doesn't have enough in-depth knowledge to understand what's the difference between your ability and the next consultant, or even your software and the next software, because they all sort of look the same. They all tell me they're going to do similar things. Often the sales approach is what actually decides it. And I think as we get further away, is that more and more your sales ability is going to make a bigger difference in your company and your ability to execute on your strategy. Because everybody can have strategy, but as well as I do is that most of the time nobody acts on it.
I just found an interesting statistic as well, Colin. And this is to do with the follow up piece that you mentioned in the previous question. 75 to 80% of B2B business deals are lost due to poor follow up or lack of follow up. Isn't that a crazy statistic? And I think what actually contributes to that number is the amount of times and the space in between in which you follow up. So every person has their own flow, every business has their own flow, every individual has their own flow, but it takes a minimum of 5 touches in terms of the follow-up process to actually bring that back up to or reduce that down to 52%. So
I,
isn't that
yeah,
nuts?
I mean the idea of follow up and having a cadence of here's how I'm going to follow up and here's what happens over that first 21 days is really interesting. I agree with the fact is most deals aren't lost. People fade away more than they just don't follow up. But even with their own clients, which is an interesting thing to watch, is that lots of clients don't leave you because your work's bad or what you do. It's just because you stopped interacting with them. You've just
Mhm,
faded away. And so follow up is huge. And
mhm.
and I always tell this story is that when I was in large account management, is I only had so many accounts I could follow up on. And I called one client, and at the time I was selling training for engineers. I followed up with one client every 2 weeks for more than 4 years. Never once called me back. Never once sent me an email saying buzz off. Got nothing from him. It was silence. And he phoned me one day. My phone rang. I was sitting in my office. I looked down at call display and I saw the number. Well, I knew the number. I mean, I could dial after dialing it for every 2 weeks. I looked at it and I picked it up. And the voice on the other, I said, Colin speaking. On the other end goes, oh, bet I bet you can't guess who's calling me. I said, not only do I know who's calling me, I'm just more surprised that your phone dialed out. And so we had a good laugh, but he gave me a great lesson, which was I didn't call you all those times you called me. He goes, you called me a lot. He said, I didn't call you because, well, I didn't need you. We
Mm.
had a partner we were working with. I was getting exactly what I needed. I didn't have a use for you. He goes, but things have changed. And that's why I'm reaching out. So it was a very interesting lesson that he was taking notes of the follow up. He knew I was following up. And the reality was I could have given up. I could have given up very quickly, but he was just in my rotation. I just followed up with him every 2 weeks. But he came, he bought over $1 million from me within 6 months of our telephone call. And so he was well worth the follow up. But often we stop because we think, well, they know I'm out here, so they'll they'll get to me if they need it. That that is more shielding that anxiety I'm feeling or the rejection I'm feeling because he doesn't call me back. And the silence seems to be the worst thing.
Because then the brain spirals, right? But also, it's like, I think in the human nature, and then you overlap that with sales psychology, is the human brain's like, I'm not getting rewarded because I don't have an answer. So I'm going to think of the most comfortable route and protect myself. And that is to stop doing what it is that is painful. I don't see any results. So therefore, there is no yield. So therefore, I will stop. But I think what's funny about that, Colin, is do you know Ryan Serhant?
Yeah. Real
I'm
estate agent.
sure anybody who's in sales know Ryan Serhant, right? He said basically he will follow up for years, years and years and years. And especially in the real estate space, I think interestingly, you have to play that long term game, right? So, because it's not like every day people are going to go out and feel like they got to sell or buy a property. So, I think what the lesson from there was, and it's something that I had to implement too, if I'm honest and transparent, is my follow up game was not that good when I first started either. And I just had to put things in place so that I wasn't sure that I was going to do it because much like anything to do front end in terms of outbound, it takes about 3 or 4 emails or touch points just to bring them back to the conversation, let alone move the needle forward. But interestingly enough, now you've watched the sales landscape shift hard over the last few years, but from where you're sitting right now, what's actually changed about how good salespeople win and what's sort of just noise?
The hard part with sales is that continuation. It's interesting that you say is I'm not seeing benefit. And the reality is that having agency over what you do is about following up where there's not an immediate benefit in sight. And so that's one of the things that we teach and provide people with is this idea of having frameworks that because it is having a structured way that you can follow up that feels safe to you, but understanding that you have to go further into the future with that. And I think right now, and it's always been like this in sales, but AI brings out this idea is I'll just defer responsibility. I'll abdicate responsibility for getting this business to an agent or somebody else. And the reality is that, now I called a client the other day and they have an AI agent who picks up their phone and answers the phone. Now I could have my AI agent, prospecting agent, talk to their AI agent who's answering the phone, and everybody can have a telephone call and nobody buys crap. You know,
Yeah, I
it,
never
it
thought about it that way, actually.
yeah, it becomes the battling AI agencies. And I think what we see and some of the research I've been seeing is referrals are still a good way to get business. Networking and trade shows, all these still produce results, but that's about human contact. It's
Mhm.
human contact first and then the follow up. And I think what we're moving to is if you go on LinkedIn or anywhere else, it's all about our AI agents will do this and do that, and they can send out 6,000 messages. If everybody's sending out 6,000 messages a day, I already know what my inbox looks like. Those type of things, they just turn them off. And so we've really been noticing that those personal touches, sometimes those little things are adding up again. And so that sometimes it's something you send in the mail. Actually, mail, interesting enough, we've noticed as a prospecting tool's gotten better, not worse.
In a way, it's overcorrected again, Colin, because of the mass production of outreach, super diluted, super unpersonalized. What's actually working now? Have you heard of something called cold cake?
Cake. No, I don't think I have.
So it's basically it was this small instance where this early agency, I think it was trying to get a hold of someone in the business that they were trying to work with. And I think, as you would know, a small guy trying to talk to a big guy is almost impossible. So what they
Recording at 6:45 a.m.
sorry, excuse me, that's just my Jarvis. So basically what they did is they sent these businesses cakes and it had a QR code on it and it said, "Hey, we just want to have a chat to you." And in a weird way, it's a pattern interrupt, but it works. And I think what I'm trying to sort of say is like it's almost like we're going back to the pamphlet dropping, the magnets on the fridge, which is actually going to make the difference because you can't mass produce it like AI can, right? And that's just I think it's so fascinating to see how human behavior evolves with technology, even with the inception of AI. I just think it's super fascinating. Lone Star isn't really a generic sales training business. It sits very specifically in the space you've called the valley between knowing and doing, and how
Yeah.
do you land on the thing that you wanted to own. Who is Lone Star really, really built for in terms of who is your like ideal sort of ICP, if you will?
Yeah. So we do a lot of work in sort of the professional services area. So Lone Star, there's two divisions of Lone Star. There's Lone Star, which typically deals with a lot of professional organizations. We have a second business called Sales Triage, which tends to work with medical. They might be doctors, nurses, typically going into consulting. And then sales anxiety is kind of the product that all of our stuff gets framed around. And most of what we do is with top end executives, helping them, especially when it's owner led sales, helping them exercise these demons that they're typically facing when it comes to anxiety, and helping them realize actually that it is actually a very normal thing.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
is very normal to feel this way. And you have to realize that anytime this type of thing comes up is that knowing it's coming up, because that'll allow you to know what to do with it. It's information. So instead of stopping, all of a sudden I can realize that this anxiety piece coming up is my issue, and what I can do then is have frameworks and things to correct that. And most of it is very correctable, but it is interesting to see what happens is that all of a sudden where that blockage was and you realize what that is, how quickly you can change it and how quickly it happens. And I was working with the VP of an accounting firm, and one of the things that her problem is cognitive clarity. So when pressure gets applied, she starts over talking, and she does the opposite of what you want in an accountant. If she over talks, she becomes unclear because she starts talking a little bit in circles. To fix that is what we have to do is get her to realize that she's doing it, and then just state one thing, one point that'll help to clarify it. She said that in once she started doing it, one thing that happened was her husband asked her if she was all right because she was doing it at home too. She was stopping and pausing before she would answer. And her husband was a little worried about her, and he said, "Oh, that's good. You should keep doing that." But the other thing that she found with was clients was that she appeared more composed to them, which is what you
Mhm.
want in an account. And by now having that pause where she realizes, I'm gonna start over talking, trying to clarify, is now she pauses, then says what she needs to say, one point that clarifies it. And it's interesting is it seems like such a simple thing, except she struggled for 10 years with this now. And she said that people would avoid bringing her into meetings with top clients because
She
she
would
would overtalk.
overcompensate.
Yeah, and and to be honest, she's brilliant. She knows exactly. But the problem is that the way she came off when it came to the sales is because she didn't think she was good at sales. She thought accountants are never good at sales, was that she felt like she had to over explain to show how much knowledge she had, which killed her in sales, but probably also hurt her politically in moving up in the organization.
Because I think what that does is so I call them that gap fillers because you can't handle that silence. So it gives you anxiety. Therefore, you feel the need and the urge to always constantly fill that gap. Guilty as charged. I used to be like that. And it just means that exactly what you mentioned before is there's actually no clarity to what you're saying because it gets diluted. So the more you say, the more dilution, and therefore the more the prospect or the customer or the client gets confused of what you're trying to actually say. Now, when I look at the overlap of human psychology and then sales psychology, what is really fascinating is a lot of people think sales is constantly selling something. And yes, to a degree it is, but I would actually challenge that and say that sales is a component where you're leading someone to an outcome. And what they mean by that is if you're able to show them that I'm going to help you through this process so that you can achieve XYZ based on that outcome, that's where the selling is, not necessarily in the proposal or the alignment stage. It's really about lowering their guard, making them feel heard, and then just guiding them to a solution rather than hard sell. This is, XYZ. And I think that's where not only the psychology, but your knack and your flair comes into place. Because ultimately people forget, even though B2B sales is a different beast on its own, you're still purchasing or selling to a human at the end of the day. And people forget that.
Yeah, it's a very human thing. And often I'll watch CEOs and others try to be perfect. And because they feel like if I say something wrong or if I do something wrong, is that will end the relationship. Well, relationships don't work that way. And the fact is that when you can clarify or say, I wasn't really clear on that, let me step back and explain it again, it actually helps the relationship, doesn't hurt the relationship. Because no one expects you to be perfect. No one expects you to have such a high standard. But if you have that, you're running that internal dialogue in your head. You're, you're trying to script everything out. You're trying to know exactly how each element of the sales call is going to go. So you're not involved in the conversation. Everybody's running off a script. And it's not necessarily that scripts are bad things. I think you should know what you want to say. But I think the real challenge is that when you take the time, as you said, when people feel listened to, when they feel like you've heard their problems, and then you're saying, I'm hearing what you're saying. Here's the things that line up with that. And here's what I would recommend based on what you're telling me. Instead of saying, here's the product, it does this, it does this, it does this. Often we're trying not to make the wrong decision when we're buying. It's not necessarily picking the best product. We're trying not to pick the worst product in effect. We're trying not to get it wrong, which that's what slows down the sales process a lot, is the fact that everybody is I think everybody's trying to play this part in it instead of listening to what the client really needs. And part of getting the client to explain what they really need is get them to think about it. I always find it amazing is that when I ask a client to clarify what does that mean and go into more depth, is they actually have to think about it. And as they talk more, you learn more.
Well,
And so
they do say, Colin, a good salesperson talks 20% of the time.
we always use the idea of triage. Triage in medicine is where you're asking the patient questions, letting them talk about where it hurts, what is it, does it hurt when you do this, before you prescribe a solution. And so really good sales reps have always been very good about questions, asking the right questions, asking more questions. If you let the client tell you exactly what they're thinking, it also helps the client to better understand what they really need when they're buying. And sometimes they're not as clear. And as you get them talking about it, they go, oh, I hadn't really thought about that, but I guess this is what we need. And so if you don't have that dialogue, if you don't have those conversations with lots of questions based on what, like if a client tells you that it's, solution is too expensive, that could mean I don't have budget. It could mean that I don't see value. It could mean that I just don't want to spend that much, or somehow I think it could be cheaper somewhere else. But how did you get there? And so the problem becomes, if I take everything a client says at face value and don't ask more questions, more clarifying questions, understand what they really mean, is that I can go down the wrong path so easily. And so it just makes sense to have the client doing most of the talking to figure out where they're starting from and where they ultimately want to go. And can I help you get there?
I think in a client scenario, do you remember that reference you were saying before about that client that overcompensated with conversation? Those are actually the best kind of clients in terms of triaging what they need, because they will always fill the gaps. And the gaps is actually where the symptoms lie of the real problem. And if you just take that time and you listen and don't interrupt, but also listen intentfully and find out what is the real pain, because it's often not initially what they think it is or what they're telling you what it is. I think a good salesperson, again, can read between the lines, and in terms of triaging, can therefore diagnose and make good recommendations, just like a doctor does, and actually see significant impact through actually solving the problem. But Colin, this has been such a good one. Honestly, the framing around composure versus confidence is going to stay with me for a very long time. And I think it's going to stay with a lot of people who are listening to. For anyone who wants to work with Colin or his team, or learn more about Lone Star and how they help founders close gaps and leaders without overcompensating with conversation, you can find all of the direct links in the show notes below. And if anything in this conversation hits a nerve, or you're a founder running a revenue side of your business off on your own, please let us know. We'd love to have a chat to you. In the meantime, keep building meaningfully. But thank you for joining us today, Colin.
Thank you for having me.